In this video, I want to discuss using the method to create this image. I'm using the Photoshop digital painting template that I've provided for you. Let me show you how I've applied it here. Here in the Photoshop file, I have my layers panel open on the left, and you can see that I've used the layers from my digital painting template. I'm going to hold down my Option button and click on the eyeball for each one of these layers to view them individually. As you can see here, I'm starting off with a toned canvas. I'm going to press Command-sign to zoom out just a little bit so we can see how this is put together. In my digital painting template, the next layer is my form layer. The form layer, when I turn that on, as you can see, is where the majority of the rendering has occurred. And as you can see, I've been fairly consistent about using only black and white. When I was rendering this, however, I did have a highlights layer above the form layer. And I did paint in areas like the side lighting on the sides of the face and the highlights on the tips of the nose and in the eyes on this highlights layer. But I've since collapsed those two layers into this one layer here. I usually like to separate the highlights and the form into separate layers, at least to begin with, before collapsing them into just one layer. Above that, I have my levels adjustments layer, and you can see that that makes quite a bit of difference. And you may ask, well, why not just paint that dark to begin with? Well, in fact, compared to how dark it ended up, I've kept this fairly light. And that's done purposefully. Because I build up my tone from light to dark, it would take me a lot longer to make it as dark as I really want. All I really need to do is keep my values consistent relative to each other, meaning that the gradient of values from my darkest darks to my lightest lights are in a consistently relative position that will allow me to use my level adjustments layer slider to achieve the full value that I really want. The next layer is my gradient map layer. And the gradient map layer applies a general color gradation to the entire image. Although I could be a bit more specific if I had made some selections. You'll notice that I actually haven't made any selections for this painting at all. If I click on this icon here in the layers panel, that'll bring up my properties panel. If I float that out here, you can see the gradient map that I've applied to my illustration so far. If I click on that, I can actually see what's going on. I'm going to start with my darkest color. You can see I actually have to click on this many times before I can actually come here, but you'll notice that my darkest color is in the violet purple range of the spectrum. Now I like to use purple as my primary shadow color, partly because I have both cool and warm light color in this illustration. The rear light is going to be warm, but in the shadows there's going to be a cool light. Because of this cool and warm mixture, purple, because it straddles the cool-warm transition on the color wheel, is a perfect color for shadows. I also really love greenish yellow for that same reason, because it transitions between the warm and cool parts of the spectrum. I'm just going to say OK. My next color, if I double click that, is warm. I have a very distinct temperature here in the color hue of orange yellow, although it is neutralized somewhat. The final highlight color of this gradient map, when I click on that, you can see is distinctly cool. And again, this is something I really like to do, is to keep my highlights on the cool side of the color spectrum. By doing that, your light has the feeling of being outdoors. Of course, you could make your highlights warm, but then your subject will always feel like it's indoors, being lit by a warm light. By keeping your colors cool, like one of my favorite illustrators, Kadir Nelson, you maintain the feeling of outdoor lighting, where the color of the sky is reflected in the highlights. And I'm just going to say OK. The next layer after that is where I begin to think about the local color of my subject. Move these out of the way. You can see that my color layer is set to soft light. There are other layer blending modes that people will often use for this same process. Some people like to use this color layer here, but my issue with that is that the color becomes much more saturated more quickly. I find the soft light a much more gentle way of applying this type of color. I'm going to have plenty of opportunity to accentuate the saturation of these colors later. You'll notice that I have all these layers inside of this grouped layer called facial features, because everything after this is optional. You don't have to do anything beyond this. It's fine. This is a lovely painting as it is. But I'm going to add a few things to this to bring out a little bit more visual interest. Now, my next layer here, as you can see, is called feather pattern and paper pattern. If I turn that layer on, you can see that it looks like this. But in fact, this was one of the last layers that I actually ended up painting. So I'm going to turn that off, and I'm going to jump to the next layer that I actually painted. In my layer stack, it's this one here called specular glow. Now, the specular glow is a subtle effect, but whenever light hits an object, the color we see is the color that is reflecting back into our eyes. But light also bounces off that surface in other directions. Depending on the atmosphere, we can often see that light as what's called a specular glow, as a sort of glow effect around the highlight areas. Now, as you can see here, my specular glow layer has been set to overlay, but I've adjusted the opacity somewhat. This is an effect that can be quickly overdone, but you can see here how that effect creates a sense of glow around the highlight areas. If I take that completely off, you can see that all I've done is painted a little bit of color with this overlay layer into some of the highlight areas. I had that down to 60. I'm just going to bring that back down like that. Again, this is not necessary. It's only something that you might want to do if you wanted to create a certain sort of glamour effect, which I kind of do here. The next layer that I've done is called the shadows layer. Let me turn that on. This shadows layer is helping to unify the color of my shadows while also deepening them and making them a little bit richer. You'll notice that I've chosen for my shadow a rather bright pink, but I've set that layer to multiply, so it's adding that color and darkening underneath. You'll notice that I've also got a mask on this layer. Let me show you what this would look like with that layer disabled. So without that mask, you can see that overall we end up with a darkening of the image. But as I've painted away some of the areas, the highlights now shine out, while the skin tones feel a little bit more unified. Again, this is not absolutely necessary. If I come back to my layers panel, you'll notice that there are 3 layers here called rim light. Each one has slightly different settings to these effects. I won't go into these in detail right now. I did end up painting on this rim light layer here. If I turn that on, you can see that, in fact, yes, it lives up to its name. And this rim light is just simply me painting white into the edges of the hair with an outer glow effect set to an orange color. Now, the next layer I added as I go up my layer stack here, I'm going to turn on this layer just so you can see what this is doing. I've created a layer set to the overlay blend mode and then filled that layer with a simple gradient using my gradient tool and some of the presets here. In fact, I've used this particular gradient for this layer. Close that. Now this creates an interesting effect. It adds a little bit more color variation to our subject. But I have some other layers here also set to color overlay. If I turn that one on, you can see that the two of them together end up creating something quite interesting. There's some color variability that I would not have otherwise achieved simply by painting. These might be a little bit strong. Again, I can always come here to the opacity slider and adjust the opacities. I'm going to turn these off. I have this last one here. I'm going to turn that one on by itself. And again, you can see that this gives a very different effect. Anyway, I have a vibrance adjustment layer over top of all of these. You can see that I've adjusted my vibrance slider, but I haven't touched my saturation slider. Saturation requires a light touch. If you're going to use your saturation slider, don't drag it too far because you'll quickly turn this into something that would be difficult to look at. Close that. So finally, I have a couple of pattern layers that are over top of everything. Let me turn these on. Here is my dots and patterns layer. And all I've done is I've created a layer that had a pattern in it, as you can see here. And then just using my wand selection tool, selected the black parts of that pattern. Then turning that layer off and painting on this layer above, set again to overlay blend mode, I've used a soft render brush to paint into this layer. If I scroll down a little bit further down here, you can see I've got this layer here called feather pattern. If I turn that on again, that was created by creating a layer that actually had a wallpaper graphic. Using my magic wand tool, I selected the black areas of that layer, like so, turning that layer off and then painting onto this layer. Of course, you don't want to see all the marching ants like that, so I'm just going to press Command H on my keyboard to hide that. But I can now paint onto this layer using my render brush, like so. Command Z. The last thing I should mention here is that I do have a layer here called facial dot. And you can see here that this is what's called a smart layer with smart filters on it. I have a set of effects on here. If I turn those off, you'll see that this layer is actually just a flattened version of the final illustration with a color halftone effect applied to it, a Gaussian blur effect applied to that, a levels adjustment, finally a hue saturation adjustment to remove all the saturation. And again, this becomes something that I can now select using my magic wand tool, just the black areas. Once those are selected, I can turn that off and now paint into my dots and patterns layer with my render brush like so. Let me turn all these layers back on. And that is how this was created.